Welcome to Torah Today Ministries and our continuing series Parshah Seasonings, where we look at the Hebrew details of the weekly Torah portion and also some of the anomalies found only in the Torah scroll. And in this week's episode, which is in Numbers 8 through 12, we find one of the most unusual and interesting anomalies to be found anywhere in the Torah scroll. But let's start at the beginning. The name of our Torah portion is Beha'alotcha, and it begins with God telling Moses to speak to Aaron concerning the lighting of the menorah in the tabernacle. Now, your translation, even if you have a Jewish translation of this passage in Numbers 8, verse 2, will probably say something like this: "Speak to Aaron and say to him, when you light the lamps." That phrase, "when you light," is what is translated from Beha'alotcha. Beha'alotcha et hanerot. The only problem is Beha'alotcha does not mean when you light. It actually means when you raise yourself up. Now, it's assumed from this that there were steps maybe going up to the menorah, and Aaron had to ascend the steps to get to the top and clean the lamps and arrange the wicks and put in the oil and do all the things that need to be done when lighting the menorah. The thing is, the menorah was only 4.5, 5.5 feet tall. You don't really need steps to get up to the top of it. So why is this word being used here? It could just as easily have said when you light the lamps, but it says when you raise yourself up to the lamps. Well, there is a beautiful drash on this that says that when we are called to be lights of the world, to bring light, especially when we serve God by bringing a holy light, that we need to raise ourselves up, not in pride and arrogance, but we need to stand up. We need to lift ourselves up, not just physically, but spiritually and even emotionally, to realize that if we're serving God in any kind of a special capacity, especially in the capacity where it brings light to others, we need to do it with joy. We need to lift ourselves up and be at our best. But the rabbis look at this even more deeply. And one of my favorite verses from Proverbs is Proverbs 6:23, where it says, "For the commandment is a lamp," and that's the same word used in the previous verse we just read, "and the Torah is light." Now, what we see here in the left-hand part of the verse, the commandment and the lamp, this is the physical part. But the Torah, the instruction, and the light, that's the spiritual part. And so the rabbis read this, that since the lamp is a picture of the commandments, that it's saying that when you raise yourself up to perform the commandments. Now, I know that's quite a stretch, and that's really moving ourselves away from the Pashat, the surface meaning of the verse. But God is always saying more than what he's saying. There's always a deeper application and a deeper lesson involved in everything that proceeds from God's mouth. But may I suggest that if we look at this verse in Proverbs again, for the commandment is a lamp. The commandments, the things you do, just like the lamps that are on the menorah, there were 7 of these lamps. This is the physical aspect of obeying God, the physical aspect of doing his will. But it says the Torah, the instruction, is light. This is something that is a little different. This is something that is not physically tangible. Though light we can see, light itself is something that is quite spiritual in nature. And may I suggest that it's possible to keep the commandments without being a light to the world. That it's possible to involve yourself in the physical aspects of obeying the Torah without really producing light, without really giving forth the instruction in the joy and in the grace and in the love with which it was given to us. And I think if we're going to fulfill the commandments in the spirit of the Torah, as well as the letter, we need to raise ourselves up. We need to stand up to full stature. The only way we can do that is to stand in true righteousness, a righteousness that comes from Messiah, from knowing him, from reflecting his countenance. And after all, he did say that you are the lights of the world. And that no one lights a candle and puts it under a bushel basket or under a bed. They put it on a hill to be seen. It has to be raised up. And he says to let our light so shine among men that they may see our good works and glorify our Father in heaven. But sometimes we tend to apply that verse that we should just let people see all of our good works. But if they do that, they give us the glory. Because it's possible to do good works without much light being produced. But we're to let our light shine so that when they see our works, they realize that they come from the same source that our light does, not from us, but from our Father in heaven. So there's much to ponder here, and I hope that after this instruction, this teaching is over, that you'll continue to ponder this and to take inventory of your own life. Are you conscientious in being a light, as well as just talking about it, and allowing Torah, the light of Torah, to go forth in your life, as well as involving yourself in the physical aspects of following the instructions that God gives us? Well, let's move on. Now, I mentioned that this Torah portion contains one of the most odd and unusual anomalies to be found anywhere in the Torah scroll. And here it is. It's in Numbers chapter 10, verses 35 and 36. The verses say this: "And whenever the ark set out, Moses said, 'Arise, Adonai, let your enemies be scattered, let those who hate you flee from before you.'" In the next verse, "And when it rested, he said, 'Return, Adonai, to the myriad thousands of Israel.'" Now those two verses appear this way in the Torah scroll. What you see here is a long gap and then an upside down backward letter nun. And then another gap of about 5 letters, and then the two verses are found. And they begin here and they conclude here. After that, there's another space, another upside down and backward letter nun, and then on the next line, the following verse begins. So right here, these are the two verses we just read. And they are bracketed between these two upside down backward letter nuns. Why? No one knows for sure. But the rabbis since ancient times have commented on this, wondering what in the world is going on. And these two verses, what are they about? When the ark would begin to move and it was time to set out, Moses say, "Arise, Lord, and let your enemies be scattered." And then when the ark would rest and say, "This is where we camp," then Moses would say, "Return, Lord, and rest among the myriad thousands of Israel." So it's about moving out and coming to a rest. Moving out, coming to a rest. And those two verses are bracketed between these two unusual letter nuns. And this is the way it's written in every Torah scroll in the world. So what's going on? Well, there's some possibilities here. And I'm sure that there are many more beyond just the ones I'm giving you. For one thing, the rabbis of ancient times in the Talmud say that these two verses, this section right here, forms its own book of the Torah, which means everything in the book of Numbers up to this point is a book of Torah. These two verses form a book of the Torah. Then everything after these two verses in Numbers form a book of the Torah. This would give the Torah 7 books instead of just 5. This is what it says. You'll find this in the Talmud in Tractate Shabbat, page 116a. Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi says, the signs are there, referring to these letters nun. The signs are there because this portion is considered a book unto itself. According to whose opinion is that which Rabbi Shemuel bar Nachman said, that Rabbi Yonatan said, that with regard to the verse, quote, With wisdom she built her house. She carved its 7 pillars, unquote. And there the rabbi is quoting Proverbs chapter 9, verse 1. That wisdom has built her house. She's carved out her 7 pillars. Then he goes on to say this. It is according to the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, as by his count there are 7 books of the Torah: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers until and when the ark traveled. Number 5, this portion and when the ark traveled, which is considered its own book. The remainder of Numbers, and then 7 would be the book of Deuteronomy. Now, that's a very odd application, and I think they're straining to make the 7 pillars of wisdom align with the 5 books of the Torah. So they conveniently just make Numbers into 3 books. Everything up to this point, then these 2 verses, then the rest of Numbers after this. So now you've got 7 books instead of 5. Maybe God does see it that way. In fact, we're going to look at something in a moment that would suggest that these 2 verses do stand on their own in a very unusual and independent way. But the letter Nun, its name means fish in Aramaic. And of course, Aramaic and Hebrew share the same alphabet. They share much of the same vocabulary, and even the grammar is very similar. And if you read one, it's not all that difficult to learn to read the other. They're sister languages. And in Aramaic, the letter Nun is spelled Nun Vav Nun, and it means fish. So there's an upside down backward fish here, and an upside down backward fish here. And Rabbi Aaron L. Raskin, in his book By Divine Design, comments on this and says, the backwards nun reminds us of our ability to turn around, to do teshuvah, repentance, and swim upstream. I like that. So these 2 fish here, which bracket these 2 verses, are a picture that we can repent and swim upstream. I like that. It's a beautiful picture. But here's another consideration. The letter Nun has a value of 50. A value of 50. And back in Genesis chapter 12, we're introduced to Torah portion Lech Lecha. Lech Lecha. Now these 2 words, Lech Lecha, are actually the same word. You can see them here. Lamed Kof, Lamed Kof. All right? And this verse, Genesis 12:1, is God speaking to Abram, and he says, go for yourself, Lech Lecha. It can mean go for yourself or go to yourself from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. Lech Lecha. Now what's interesting is these 2 words, which are spelled the same, though pronounced differently, each of those words has a numerical value of 50. So you see the word Lamed Kaf twice. And each of those words is 50. And then in our portion in Numbers, you see a nun and a nun, each of which equal 50. And so a connection can be made here. That these 2 verses in Numbers, which are about God leading and bringing to rest, and then leading us to step out, saying, okay, now pause here. Now it's time to lead out again. That this is, in essence, Abram's experience. And this is what God asked Abram to do. Go for yourself from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. In other words, walk with me. And we know there are times Abram would travel, then he would rest, and then he would travel again and rest. And Abram is called a believer. Abram's called the friend of God. Abram is the father of all who believe, Paul tells us in the book of Romans. And so if we are going to walk in the faith of Abraham, we need to learn when to walk, when to rest, when to walk, and when to rest. The ancient commentators go further with this, and they take these 3 promises that God makes to Abram that follow this verse. In verse 2 says, and I will make of you a great nation. and I will bless you. And third, I will make your name great so that you will be a blessing. And Rashi states, since traveling causes three things. A, it diminishes being fruitful and multiplying. I mean, if you're always on the move, it's kind of difficult to make a family. It diminishes money, since you're never putting down roots and occupying yourself with a career and earning money. And third, it diminishes reputation, since you're just passing through the places you go. People don't really get to know you, and your reputation, your character, doesn't have a chance to develop and to proclaim itself and to provide a model, an example of who you really are in your walk with God. But Rashi goes on, says, therefore he, God, was bound to these three blessings. He was promised about sons. Even though he's on the move, it's hard to make a family on the move. He was promised about sons, about money when he says, and I will bless you, and about reputation when he says, and you will be a blessing. When I came across this, it really spoke to me because I know early in my walk of faith, my concern was if I really follow God, if I really do the things he asked me to do, to go where he asked me to go and do what he asked me to do, will I have a family? Will I always be traveling? Will I be blessed with a home and with finances and the things I may need? And what about my reputation? Will people just think I'm a weirdo? Well, I decided if God isn't real, then I'll just cash it all in. But if he is real, I'm going to do this right. And I've tried to follow God. I floundered around quite a bit, but as I've followed him and walked with him and done things that he has clearly shared with me to do, he has blessed me with a family. He's blessed me with home and with all the things I've ever needed. And he's given me friends. He's given me people who are dear friends of mine, and has allowed me to have a reputation. Maybe a little soiled at times, a little tarnished here and there, but he has allowed me to live in a place where I have friends and neighbors and acquaintances who have known me for a long period of time, and we've built up very close friendships because of that. And so I have to believe that any person who would truly follow God in faith and walk in the steps of Abraham, and I hope you all do better than I have, but God keeps his promises. And we don't have to be afraid of walking his steps and moving out when it's time to move. Now, when I mentioned that the letter nun means fish, you may have been thinking of the symbol that represents believers today, which is the fish. And that goes back to ancient times, because the Greek word for fish, ichthus, the letters that spell that refer to Yeshua, the Messiah, Savior, and Redeemer. And so the fish has been a symbol of the Messianic faith for the last 2,000 years. And what I find interesting is that if we look at the verses leading up to these two that are bracketed, we find that the verses right before are about Israel moving. Here, let me just read them to you. If we look at verses 33 and 34, it says, so they set out from the Mount of Adonai 3 days' journey, and the ark of the covenant of Adonai went before them 3 days' journey to seek out a resting place for them, and the cloud of Adonai was over them by day whenever they set out from the camp. So the two verses before this section, we see Israel doing its thing, going on its way and making progress. But then the two verses right after these two, after the bracketed pair, in Numbers chapter 11, verses 1 and 2, it says this, and the people complained in the hearing of Adonai about their misfortunes. And when Adonai heard it, his anger was kindled, and the fire of Adonai burned among them and consumed some outlying parts of the camp. Then the people cried out to Moses, and Moses prayed to Adonai, and the fire died down. So we see these two verses, and what comes right before is Israel moving through the wilderness, and everything is kind of going all right. But the two verses right after them, we see fiery judgment. And then in the middle are these two verses bracketed by fish. Now maybe I'm making too much of this, but I don't think so. I wouldn't be sharing it with you. I think these two verses, this anomaly, this almost like a break that where these two verses are imposed in here. If these two verses weren't there, we wouldn't notice their absence, but they're stuck in there and they're bracketed in this very unusual way. I think these two verses are a picture of the last 2,000 years. The 2,000 years of the fish. The 2,000 years of the Gentile believers who are trying to walk with God, who are trying to walk in step with Him. And right before these 2,000 years, we see Israel kind of doing their thing. But after these 2,000 years, when this age of the Gentiles is over, we see God's judgment now coming into the earth, a fiery judgment. But in between, we have these 2,000 years, just as here in Numbers we have these two verses. You know, if the leadership of Israel 2,000 years ago had embraced Yeshua as their king, their Messiah, their deliverer, the millennial kingdom would have come way back then. But because of the hatred without a cause that was manifested and modeled by the leaders of Israel, not the people themselves, but by the wicked leadership, that has been delayed, and it's been delayed for 2,000 years. And we're just about the end of those 2,000 years. And when these 2,000 years are over, then we see a time of tribulation and very serious judgment. And we see fire. And that's about as far as I'm going to go. I don't want to get into all kinds of end-time prophecy. As you know, I don't delve into that too much. But I think there's something going on here, much more than meets the eye. So I encourage you to think about it. And please don't hesitate to leave comments if you have some insights about this. So anyways, there's the two fish, the two nuns that bracket these two verses about God moving and resting, leading His people, then making them rest. And to me, it's fascinating. And again, as I said at the beginning of this, there's probably much more going on than I or anyone knows. And I wait to see when we get to speak to Moses himself and the world to come. Say, hey, what was going on with these two verses that were bracketed by the letter Nun? So, with that, let's move on to chapter 12, verse 3. I always have to chuckle when I read this verse. It says, now the man Moses was very humble, more than all the people who are on the face of the earth. And when you realize that Moses himself wrote that verse, I mean, what do you do with that? Either it's absolutely true and he was so humble that he could just talk about his humility as if it's like, what's the big deal? Or he had to be the most proud of all people to write that verse. Well, I believe he was truly the most humble and meek person on the earth. And there you can see the verse as it appears in Hebrew. And this verse has a numerical value of 1,774. And there's a verse in Psalms that also has that same numerical value. It's Psalm 113, verse 7, which says, He raises the poor from the dust and lifts the needy from the ash heap. You know, we don't have to fear being humble in this world. We don't have to fear being meek, because being humble and meek does not mean that you are weak or insignificant. But one of the things I've learned, and I often say this in my teachings, is that the secret to spiritual power is smallness and anonymity. And if we can simply embrace humility, we will find it to be our best friend. And humility is the beginning of wisdom. And I know that we're told several times that if we raise ourselves up not as we read here early in Numbers, that we raise ourselves up to light the menorah, but the one who elevates himself and exalts himself will be humiliated, to be brought low. But if we humble ourselves in the eyes of Adonai, in due time he'll lift us up. So the surest way of making sure that you are recognized in a wholesome, healthy, and in a truly godly way is to embrace humility. And of course, when Moses wrote this, there was no competition in the humility department. But there's one who came later who was even more humble, and that was Yeshua himself, who made none of the mistakes that Moses made. And his humility was such that he allowed himself to be nailed to a cross. A perfectly innocent man, a godly man, the Son of God himself. And he allowed himself to be nailed to a cross without making a peep, and to be unjustly accused. And because of this, God has elevated him to his own right hand. So, if you want the key to real joy and peace in your life, if you want the striving in your life to come to an end, then embrace humility. I came across something interesting that just popped into my head. The word humility or humble in Hebrew is anav. It's ayin, nun, vav. And if you take the last two letters, it spells the word avon, aleph, vav, nun, which means wickedness. It's guilt. It's like a rebellious sin. So anav and avon are spelled with the same three letters. And it's almost like in between there's no middle ground. You're either one or you're the other. You either humble yourself or you're going to do things your own way, live in rebellion, and experience real avon, guilt and sin, trespass in your life. But again, there's no middle ground. So don't aim for half humble, because to be half humble means to be half arrogant. And God doesn't stomach that very well. Just choose humility. And I don't think you'll ever have reason to complain if you do. So with that, I wish you shalom, and may God bless.
Thank you for joining us for today's teaching. If the work of Torah Today Ministries has touched your life, please consider making a donation or sponsoring an upcoming video. As a video sponsor, you'll have an exclusive opportunity to memorialize a family member, celebrate a special event, or simply support the ongoing creation of similar content. Your tax-deductible contribution helps ensure that our teachings continue to reach all who are longing for truth. Click the link or visit our website to learn more.
Until next time.